Eduardo.
Dr. Warren and the Committee of Correspondence has sent us the warning. The British should be here soon.
In this episode of Drive Through History, we continue our travels through New York. First up, I decided my faithful orange companion needed a good bath. In this episode, I get to visit the place where George Washington was sworn in as our very first president, and see where he and all of our newly elected leaders attended a church service to thank God for his faithfulness and to pray for our new nation. We will learn about the humble beginnings of Wall Street high finance, and then travel upstate to West Point and the Saratoga Battleground. Wall Street is a street in the lower Manhattan part of New York City. The name has become synonymous with the financial district of New York City and the nation. During the 17th century, Wall Street served as the northern boundary to what was the Dutch settlement. In the middle of that century, a protective wall was built along here to serve as a defense, first against the Indians and then later against the British. Over the years, it was added to and strengthened until it was a 12-foot-high palisade built of timber and earth. The wall was dismantled by the British in 1699. In the late 18th century, there was a buttonwood tree, also called an American sycamore tree, at the foot of Wall Street. Under the cover of this large shade tree, speculators would gather to trade. In 1792, the traders created a formal association called the Buttonwood Agreement. This was the origin of the New York Stock Exchange. Looking down this street with its towering skyscrapers, it's almost impossible to imagine the humble beginnings of the most important financial district in the United States. Could this really be the same location that just a few men gathered under the shade of a tree to trade with each other? The next stop is Federal Hall. It's located catty-corner from the New York Stock Exchange. This is Federal Hall, located at 26 Wall Street, here in New York City. Now, New York was the very first capital of the United States of America under a constitution and with a president. It's also the site, though not the actual building, where George Washington was sworn in as America's first president in 1789. In fact, this statue is commemorating that moment. It's also the location where the United States Bill of Rights was passed. The original building was also once the New York City Hall. It was demolished and replaced by the current structure in 1812. Federal Hall National Memorial, as it's known today, is operated by the National Park Service as a museum. My primary reason for being here today is to talk about the swearing in of our first president of the United States. Washington journeyed to New York City from his home in Virginia. It became a triumphal procession as crowds and local officials greeted the new president along the way. Celebrations erupted in numerous towns along his route, including Alexandria, Baltimore, Wilmington, Philadelphia, and Trenton. Washington arrived at Elizabethtown, New Jersey on April 23rd, where a ceremonial barge awaited to take him across the river to Manhattan. Now imagine the scene, the whole city anxiously awaiting on the morning of Thursday, April 30th. At 8 o'clock, some clouds were forming on the horizon, causing some apprehensions as some thought it would be an unpleasant day. But by 9, the sun was out and the church bells began to ring. And then, arriving at 12 in full military procession was Washington himself, attended by many who had fought with him in the Long War. Baron von Steuben, the man who whipped the dispirited Valley Forge troops into shape, and Henry Knox, the hero of the Battle of Dorchester Heights in Boston, and now the Secretary of War, were both in attendance. John Adams, co-author of the Declaration of Independence, was there to serve as Washington's vice president. And John Jay, patriot and signer of the Declaration, and future first Justice of the United States Supreme Court, was on hand. Washington was dressed in a suit of dark brown cloth with white silk stockings. And as represented in this famous statue, Washington held his open hand on a Bible that had been placed on a rich crimson velvet cushion. After taking his oath, he kissed the Bible reverently, closed his eyes, and in an attitude of devotion said, "So help me God." The chancellor exclaimed, "It is done," and turning to the people, he shouted, "Long live George Washington, the first president of the United States." Washington addressed a joint session of Congress with a short handwritten speech. It would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that almighty being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States. He also said, "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States." After his inauguration, George Washington and the members of Congress celebrated by attending church. They walked just a few short blocks up this street to this beautiful Georgian-style building, St. Paul's Church. The Thanksgiving service was officiated by the congressional chaplain. St. Paul's Chapel is the oldest building in continuous use in New York City. Its construction was completed in 1766. Back in the day, it stood in a field some distance from the city. Today, it is surrounded by skyscrapers. Now imagine the scene. In its brief history, the United States of America had a constitution, an elected body of representatives, and a president. And their first act together was to go attend divine services. Now, as they worshiped, they turned and faced this altar. It's a very special altar designed by architect Pierre L'Enfant, who was a Revolutionary War hero, a member of Washington's staff, and the original designer of Washington, D.C. The sculpture created by L'Enfant depicts Mount Sinai in clouds and lightning. The Hebrew name for God, Yahweh, is found at the top of the display. The 10 Commandments on 2 large tablets are at its base. President Washington attended church here for the 2 years that New York served as the nation's capital. That's the reason why the presidential seal is hanging over the pew he used during that time. St. Paul's Chapel has been serving the poor and helping those in need for longer than we've even been a nation. And did you know that it was almost destroyed when it was only 10 years old? After the Battle of Long Island, New York City was under British control, and a fire broke out in this part of the city. When it was all over, nearly 1/4 of New York City had been destroyed. Nobody knows how it got started, but St. Paul's Chapel survived to help the homeless. Did I mention that St. Paul's Chapel is right across the street from Ground Zero? The site of the World Trade Center literally borders the church grounds. St. Paul's Chapel survived that catastrophic event in a way that some people consider to be miraculous. There wasn't even a broken window. After the attack, St. Paul's Chapel served as a place where recovery workers working at the World Trade Center could find rest, comfort, and refuge. For 8 months after 9/11, hundreds of volunteers worked 12-hour shifts around the clock, serving meals, making beds, counseling, and praying with firefighters, construction workers, police, and others. St. Paul's Chapel is a national landmark and a very important part of United States history. It's a place I won't soon forget. You know, there are many points in a war that can be accurately called a turning point, because with the benefit of hindsight, we can determine whether or not an event set into motion a series of consequences, some good, some bad. But there can be no doubt that the next battle site that we're visiting here on Drive Through History played host to one of the most important events in the entire Revolutionary War. And the battles here turned the tide toward an almost inevitable American victory. Now, the battles of Saratoga, there were two back-to-back battles here, were dramatic. But I'll bet there's something you didn't know. One of the great heroes of the battles of Saratoga went on to become one of the world's most notorious traitors. Hero? Traitor? How can one man embody both of those qualities? The battles of Saratoga in September and October 1777 were decisive American victories, and they resulted in the surrender of an entire British army of some 9,000 men. But it's actually two separate battles that occurred 18 days apart. The first is called the Battle of Freeman's Farm. The second is called the Battle of Bemis Heights. Both battles took place on the same ground, about 9 miles south of Saratoga, New York. Here was the original idea. British General John Burgoyne, with some 8,000 men, would come down from the north, and then he would meet up with Colonel Barry St. Ledger, who was heading east with a mixed force of about 600 Loyalists, Canadians, and 1,000 Iroquois Indians. Then William Howe, commanding the main British army in New York City, would march from the south to join General Burgoyne in Albany, New York, not far from here. If successful with this plan, the British would have isolated the New England states from the rest of America. However, there was a fly in the ointment, as they say. General Howe failed to follow the plan. Instead of marching north to join Burgoyne, Howe went south and attacked Philadelphia, the American capital, which must have seemed like a glorious idea to him at the time. Because of the slow and difficult communications of the period, Burgoyne did not hear of this change in Howe's plans until it was too late. You ever have one of those periods where everything just seems to be going downhill from bad to worse? Well, General Burgoyne had that happen to him right here. Now, the first problem was that he took the wrong travel route, which slowed him down and depleted his resources. Hey! He then sent 12,000 Hessian troops out to raid nearby farms. They were met and destroyed by the Vermont militia at the Battle of Bennington. He then got a letter from General Howe stating that he would be a no-show. And he finally found out that the Loyalists, the Canadians, and the Indians would also be unable to join him. The tides were turning against the British and the Germans. This thing isn't loaded, is it? Yeah, that would leave a mark. Militia from all over New York and the New England states, responding to Washington's call, were making their way to the American camp as Burgoyne drew closer. The British invasion force was being steadily reduced, but the American army was growing. Now, I'd like to point out that much of the fighting here at Saratoga happened in the woods, as the American forces forced General Burgoyne's army into the woods because it put them at a tremendous disadvantage. It has nothing to do with the fact that it's 95 degrees outside and the sun is shining and I'm beginning to sweat a map of New England on my belly. Oh, there's Cape Cod. Over here, it looks like Martha's Vineyard. Oh, Nantucket. You know, my wife and I stayed at a great bed and breakfast there one day. Anyway, as matters came to a head, the Americans got a new commander, General Horatio Gates. Now, General Gates assumed command on August 19th, but he had never led troops into battle before. Now, over the course of the summer, the American forces grew to roughly 15,000 men as militias poured in from Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, New York, and even as far away as Virginia. They were dug in and ready for a fight. The American forces had numbers on their side, but not organizational skills. And there was another problem. Benedict Arnold, who had command of the left wing of the American army, hated his superior, General Gates, and the feeling was mutual. Benedict Arnold correctly predicted that the British would hit the American left, and he asked General Gates if he could send a force through Freeman's farm to meet them there. Gates grudgingly agreed. The British got a late start. A dense morning fog limited their vision. By noon, it had burned off, and they got underway. Benedict Arnold, meanwhile, had ridden out to the far left flank and asked Colonel Daniel Morgan and his Virginia sharpshooters to stop the British advance. The first shots dropped every officer in the advance and threw the others into retreat. When they saw this, Morgan's men charged recklessly forward. They managed to drive the British light infantry back, but everything changed when the Americans ran into the British grenadiers' bayonets. The American advance quickly became a retreat. This set the pattern for the remainder of the battle. Benedict Arnold wanted to seize the day through a mere aggressive attack. 3 times he begged Gates for more men. 3 times he was refused. The argument broke out and Gates relieved Arnold of his command. The British won the day, but at a very high cost. Burgoyne's men suffered over 600 casualties and were running out of supplies. In contrast, the American forces were growing stronger, with fresh militia units arriving daily. Time was against Burgoyne, but he decided nevertheless to stay and fight in the hopes that his reinforcements would show up. It was a fateful decision. On October 7th, Burgoyne launched an assault on the American positions on Bemis Heights. Things did not begin well for the British. Meanwhile, at Gates' headquarters, Benedict Arnold paced nervously at the sounds of battle. He had been removed from command, and Gates refused to see him. Finally, he leapt to his horse and rode towards the firing. Arnold went to the light battalions on the west of the line. Next, Arnold rode to the central action. The men there were having a rough time handling the Hessian advance. Arnold helped to rally the men and led a counterattack. The Hessians began to withdraw. Not content with merely stopping the British advance, Benedict Arnold led his men in a charge here at Bremen's redoubts on the right flank of the British fortifications. While leading the charge on his horse, Benedict Arnold was shot in the leg. He was out of the battle, but his men captured their objective. That night, darkness saved General Burgoyne from utter defeat. But at the end of the day, Burgoyne's losses came to about 1,000 men, including the casualties sustained at the Battle of Freeman's Farm, while the American losses came to about 500 men killed and wounded. Burgoyne was now outnumbered 3-1. It soon became apparent to Burgoyne that he could neither have victory or effectively stage a retreat. He decided to negotiate a surrender. In full ceremonial uniform, General Burgoyne led his troops out from his camp on October 17, 1777, and was greeted with formal cordiality by General Gates. In the grounding of arms at Saratoga, 5,791 men were surrendered. The total loss of the British and their German auxiliaries in killed, wounded, prisoners, and deserters during the campaign was 9,000 men. The importance of the battles of Saratoga and the surrender of Burgoyne's army cannot be overstated. The French, who had been providing covert aid to the American rebels for some time, now decided that the Americans were a good bet to win. France and the United States signed a treaty of mutual alliance in February 1778, and France's declaration of war on Britain followed soon after. It was the valor of the American soldiers and the leadership of its officers, like Benedict Arnold, that won the day. Benedict Arnold's brave charge here at Bremen's redoubt on October 7th was the climax of over 2 years of brilliant military service to the American cause. His leg wound would leave him bedridden for the better part of a year. And after that, Arnold became the most notorious traitor in American history. Arnold asked for the fort at West Point, which he was plotting to hand over to the enemy. Later that year, his treason was exposed, and Arnold fled to the British to avoid arrest. While Benedict Arnold's name is nowhere mentioned on any of the monuments at the Saratoga battlefield, his service is honored still in two very odd ways. The Saratoga Monument Obelisk has niches holding three statues of three American generals on three of its sides: Schuyler, Morgan, and Gates. The fourth side, which would be honoring Benedict Arnold had he not later betrayed his country, is empty. An even more impressive memorial to his heroism is right here. It's called the Boot Monument. The Boot Monument shows a boot with the stars of a major general. And it stands on the spot where Benedict Arnold was shot in the leg while charging Bremen's Redoubt on October 7th. The monument is dedicated to, quote, the most brilliant soldier of the Continental Army. And it nowhere includes the name Benedict Arnold. According to legends, Arnold, in his later career as a British general and an infamous traitor, asked an American captive in Virginia what the Americans would do to him if they ever caught him. His reply was, "We would cut off your leg and bury it with full military honors for your work at Quebec and Saratoga. The rest of you, we would hang." What are you doing? Just keep the camera, pan it off. I think these are the perfect shades to be driving around West Point in. I mean, all the cadets are wearing these. The latest new thing in the military. And welding. After the British captured New York City, they controlled the Hudson River up to a point, West Point. I'm here at West Point, about 50 miles north of New York City, here in Orange County, New York. Now, the British wanted to control the Hudson River as a critical part of their divide the colonies and conquer strategy. But it was here that George Washington figured that he could stop the powerful British Navy from further advancement. Cannons placed high atop this bluff could menace any ship. Washington determined that West Point was, quote, the most important post in America and the key to the continent. He ordered that it be strongly fortified. Washington selected Thaddeus Kosciuszko to have chief direction and superintendence. Kosciuszko undertook the task of building a series of layered defensive positions here at West Point. So thorough were these fortifications that the British never even mounted an assault on the point. One of the more creative links in the colonel's defensive plan, so to speak, was a 60-ton chain that he had stretched across the Hudson River to block British ships. Here's a big piece of it right here. Now, where are you going? I'm not done yet. Forget it. Thaddeus Kosciuszko had fought in battle with Benedict Arnold in the battles of Saratoga, and both had distinguished themselves with valor there. But it was here at West Point where Benedict Arnold would go on to become America's most infamous traitor. Arnold had spent about a year recovering from a leg wound he had received at Saratoga, and he had asked for and received a command at West Point. Unbeknownst to Washington, however, Benedict Arnold had cooked up a scheme to sell out the American cause. He had secretly met with British officer John Andre, an aide to British General Henry Clinton. Together they hatched a plan whereby Arnold would hand over West Point to the enemy for the payment of a large sum of money, plus a commission in the British Army. After the secret meeting with Arnold, John Andre, disguised as a civilian, was riding on horseback returning to the British camp when he was captured and taken to Washington's headquarters. Whoopsie! A letter was discovered in his boot revealing the plan of betrayal. The letter contained the name of you-know-who. Benedict Arnold. plan to surrender West Point was foiled, and Benedict Arnold narrowly escaped capture by the Americans. He received his money and his commission, but John Andre, on the other hand, was tried by the Americans and hanged in 1780. Benedict Arnold maintained until his death that he had done the right thing by switching sides, and even wrote a letter to George Washington trying to convince him of his cause. But he died a man without a country. Arnold lived in Canada for a while, but was run out by an angry mob who burned him in effigy in his front yard. Then he lived in England for a while and was shunned by many, and even fought in a duel to defend his honor there. But taking a bribe to sell out your country is not exactly a road to popularity. Calling somebody a Benedict Arnold in America is perhaps the ultimate insult. Benedict Arnold, a hero at Saratoga, a traitor at West Point. On July 4th, 1802, under President Thomas Jefferson, West Point became the United States Military Academy. In this Drive-Through History series, I've had the great privilege to visit the most important battle sites in the founding of America. It's humbling for me to think about all the sacrifices that were made throughout the years so that I can enjoy my freedom today. This is one of the reasons I think history is so important. We can't appreciate what we don't honor and remember. So read about American battles, visit these places, and honor the sacrifices that were made for you.
Hey, little guy. How you doing? Cute. Just kind of hanging around here, Saratoga. Oh, that's cute, little.
Ow! Fine. Get that way.
It's very hot here. It's due to the global warmings and all of these things.